Thus far in this animation retrospective, we've seen significant strides in the evolution of Final Fantasy's narrative toolkit. We've seen the earliest uses of gameplay systems to stage key story moments. We've seen the first story cutscene, and we've seen the emergence of actual characters, and of stories which primarily focus on those characters. There's just one problem. The animation in these games is not really contributing much on that front. As you have no doubt noticed, the evolution of Final Fantasy's animation across these first 4 entries has been incremental at best. We spent 3 entire games with a playable cast who were capable of only 2 things: walking and fighting. We've only just started to see characters with the ability to visibly emote at all. The basic foundation of the Final Fantasy narrative experience may be taking shape, but this new character-centric approach can only go so far without characters who can actually express a full range of emotion. It's time for the animation to start pulling some more weight. Welcome to the animation of Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy V was released in Japan in 1992, and wouldn't see a Western localization until the Final Fantasy Anthology port for the PlayStation in 1999. As Final Fantasy games are wont to do, this game tells a story of magic crystals under threat. The Wind Crystal has suddenly shattered, and all across the world the breeze has stilled. Almost as if in response to this calamity, a strange meteor falls from the sky, an event which will ultimately draw together 4 heroes who must find a way to protect the remaining 3 crystals and fight back against the ancient evil they are secretly sealing. It is a somewhat stock premise as Final Fantasies go, but that's fine because we're in a post-Final Fantasy IV world and this ship runs on characters now. You've got Lena, Princess of the Kingdom of Tycoon. You've got Ferris, a pirate captain, who is also a princess of Tycoon. It's complicated. There's Galuf, an amnesiac man found unconscious at the meteor crash site. And of course there's... Bartz, a wanderer who gets swept up in all this by chance. Oh, and also there's Galuf's granddaughter Kryl. Can't forget her. It's a much smaller playable cast than we saw in Final Fantasy IV, and that's mostly for one very practical reason that we'll talk about in a minute, but you get to spend a lot of time with this bunch, and they all get a lot of time to know each other. This is in part because, unlike Final Fantasy IV, which mostly centered its story around a single character, Final Fantasy V's ensemble tends to share the spotlight. But it's also because Final Fantasy V is simply a much bigger game. Squaresoft ramped up production big time for Final Fantasy V. The development team tripled in size, going from a headcount of 14 to 45. The game itself shipped on cartridges with twice the memory capacity, allowing that larger team to squeeze even more stuff into the game. And that increased budget is noticeable. Where Final Fantasy IV often looked like a slightly enhanced port of one of the NES titles, this feels like a proper 16-bit upgrade. The background art is lavish, the story cutscenes and the complexity of their presentation has increased significantly, and the sprite count per character? Well, let's just get into it. Final Fantasy V represents the largest increase in animation scope this franchise has seen yet, and the main reason for that is the return of the job system. First introduced in Final Fantasy III, the job system allowed playable characters to swap combat classes whenever the player wanted. Any of your characters could be switched to any job. But you will recall that this feature had a significant narrative drawback. It turned Final Fantasy III's characters into completely blank slates, a quartet of faceless combat units entirely defined by their current job. There was nothing more to them than their name and whatever hat you were making them wear. Final Fantasy IV had approached characters completely differently. On top of having unique visual designs and personalities, each character's combat role was predetermined, unchangeable, and integral to their character. Every character's combat abilities helped to give them identity, to define them. Final Fantasy V takes a hybrid approach. These characters have predetermined names, except for Bartz, I guess, and they all have unique designs. And they all can switch jobs at will, but when they do, though they will change into an appropriate costume, they remain recognizably themselves. No matter what job you choose for these characters, they will always be visually distinct from their companions. Bart's will look like Bart's, whether he is a knight, or a monk, or a chemist, or a ranger. If you decide to make both Lena and Ferris be red mages, they will continue to look like Lena and Ferris, but in cooler hats. You can turn your entire party into the same class, and they will continue to be easily recognizable as Bart's, Lena, Ferris, and Galuf, and also Kryle. And that persistence of character didn't come cheap. There is no clever trick at play here. This was simply achieved by creating a full set of combat sprites for every playable character for every single job in the game. Take Lena here. This is her default, or freelancer, class design, and it comes with the standard suite of poses. An idle pose, a walking pose, a ready or defending pose, an attack pose, 2 more poses for attacking with a left-handed weapon, 2 spell charging poses, an ability or victory pose, a hit react pose, a wounded pose, and a knocked out pose. But then say you decide to make Lena be a white mage. Well, she's got a whole new set of sprites specifically for that job. Or maybe you make her into a summoner, or a dragoon, or a blue mage. No matter which class you choose, she has got a full set of sprites for it. Except for the knocked out pose, all of the jobs just use the freelancer version for that one. This functionally means that where Final Fantasy IV's characters each had about 12 total frames of animation for combat, Final Fantasy V's player characters have 11 unique frames per job. And with 22 total jobs included in the game's original release, plus that one shared knocked out pose, that means that each playable character has up to 243 unique frames of animation just for combat alone. 243, my mathematically inclined friends have assured me, is a much larger number than 12. Kazuko Shibuya, who hadn't done any sprite work for Final Fantasy IV because she'd been busy working on Romancing Saga at the time, split this massive character art workload with Hiromi Ito, and even combining their efforts, it still took the two of them an entire year to churn through the sprite art for these jobs. But the payoff, I would argue, is well worth that scope explosion because, thanks to this enormous sprite library, Final Fantasy V can offer all of the gameplay flexibility of a job system while simultaneously enjoying all of the narrative benefits of maintaining a cast of consistently defined characters. And that's not the only win here. Look a little closer at all of these sprites and you'll see that there's actually a fair amount of posing variety from character to character, and from class to class. Bart's casting a spell as a freelancer is posed differently than Bart's casting a spell as a black mage. Bart's casting a spell as a red mage looks different than Bart's casting a spell as a monk, and what's more, Bart's casting a spell as a monk is also posed differently than Lena casting a spell as a monk, or Galuf, or Ferris, or Kryle. Or look at the hit reacts. Look at how much variety there is in the posing, not only across each class a character might be at any given time, but also across every other character's unique incarnation of that class. Pretty impressive given these sprites are still just 16 pixels wide and 24 tall. The one thing that would have put this over the top for me is if this varied posing was more driven by character personality. Because that pose variety, though great, does often feel more arbitrary than character-driven. Of course, previous Final Fantasies fared little better on this particular front, but the absence of consistent characterization feels a little more noticeable this time because these characters can change combat roles so frequently. Final Fantasy IV got so much mileage out of using each character's job to communicate more about them, but Final Fantasy V's playable characters just can't be defined by their job. They change jobs constantly. It's entirely under the player's control. And given that, it's a bit of a shame that there's so little consistent characterization happening in each character's posing across all of those jobs. Now, Shibuya-san has mentioned in interviews that character personality was very much something she was thinking about as she designed the sprites for each job, and I believe her. Especially in the costume designs, you can clearly see specific choices being made for how each character wears each role. But whether it's due to the constraints of sprite size, or simply a consequence of having to generate so many job variants of each pose for each character, it is difficult to find discernible posing trends across these jobs which might help to convey any given character's unique personality. Like, Ferris and Galuf might cast spells differently as dragoons, but nothing about these poses is expressing who these two are as people. Even so, the enormous effort required to keep Bartz, Lena, Ferris, Galuf, and Kryl recognizable across 22 jobs achieves exactly what it needs to. Because at the end of the day, the entire point of all of this work is to keep the characters in the spotlight, to not let the fun gameplay feature obscure their presence or compromise their individual value to the story. But while this scope increase is impressive, the game's biggest animation win happens outside the battle screen. It was Final Fantasy IV which first introduced emote poses to the series, additional unique sprites which finally allowed these characters to perform and express themselves in story scenes. But this vital addition was ultimately still a pretty sparse one at the time, a mere 4 poses per character, maybe 1 or 2 additional custom sprites for specific scenes. Where Final Fantasy IV had approached the pool of narrative animation and dipped in a cautious toe, Final Fantasy V does a cannonball. These characters have somewhere between 18 and 20 emote poses each, dramatically increasing their expressive range. Where previous entries had to make do with locomotion sprites when blocking out story scenes, Final Fantasy V's characters can actually perform. For the first time, these characters can actually gesture, and react, and visually express themselves. And not just the main cast. Even the game's NPCs each have 8 to 9 emote poses of their own to work with, more than the previous game's main cast had. This frog literally has almost 5 times Cecil's expressive range. So, what are these poses? Well, your playable characters can now look to one side, raise their hand, wave at us, wave away from us, go to sleep, laugh, look shocked, get hype, get sad sideways, get sad backwards, fall on their butt, fall on their face, play rock, paper, scissors, I guess. Really, that's the best part. Just like with the combat sprites, these emote poses aren't limited to just a single purpose. This new arsenal of expression can be used not just for simple gestures, but repurposed to mime out more complex actions. Now, characters can scratch their head, take cover behind a wall, fall off a roof. They can climb up a cliff, throw a rope across a ravine, and tie it off. And yes, these actions are still very crudely animated. Your brain usually has to fill in a lot of gaps to interpret what these simple motions are meant to imply. But what an enormous difference it makes watching a story play out with characters who are actually animated. Final Fantasy V's characters are capable of so much more than the previous casts, and even actions which the previous Final Fantasies could probably have managed are just looking so much better than they otherwise would. Like, take this moment where Bartz falls off his chocobo. The bird screeches to a halt without warning, and he flies off of it in his panicked pose, bounces a few times, and smacks into the wall. There's a big screen shake on the impact, and then he settles into that fell on his butt pose against the rock wall before finally getting back up to his feet. That's actually a pretty complex physical action to convey with 2 16x16 sprites, and you simply could not get that same level of clarity or appeal from Final Fantasy IV's limited pose library. And good luck animating Kain throwing a rope. Now, something that you might notice about the emote animations here is that they are very big. I mean, not the characters, obviously, they're very small. But because they are so tiny, the emotes and expressions they make have to be proportionally huge. They have to be broad and exaggerated to be understood at this tiny scale. Real actors actually have to do this too. When preparing a character performance, one important variable the actor must consider is the medium. How is the audience going to experience your performance? Is the audience watching you perform this in a theater? If so, you're not only going to need to project your voice and speak your lines more loudly so that people in the back can hear, but you're also going to have to act bigger, gesture bigger, be a little larger than life so that your performance is visible even to the people up in the cheap seats. After all, you can't hinge your performance on a change in facial expression that only the people in the first few rows are going to be able to see. But if you're performing this role to a film camera, that requires a completely different style of acting. More naturalistic, more subtle. In a close-up shot, you can assert status and power over a scene with your eyes alone. At such an intimate distance, every curl of the lip or dart of the eyes communicates thought, and everyone watching you on screen can see every muscle in your face. A wry grin or a clenching of the jaw can speak volumes. Even the choice to blink or not blink can make an enormous difference in how your character is perceived and how much status they hold in a scene. None of this stuff would be visible in a theater. At 16 by 16 pixels, these tiny little sprites are the video game equivalent of an actor performing to a football stadium. So, in order for this tiny clump of pixels to make its emotions immediately clear, it has to act as broadly as possible. If this character thinks something is funny, they gotta laugh big. If the character's surprised by something, they gotta look shocked. Eyes as big as saucers, limbs splayed out. And notice that the acting isn't just big, but exaggerated. It's pantomime. Pantomime, if you've not heard that term before, is a nonverbal style of acting, which relies on exaggerated physical gesture and facial expression. This particular form of acting has appeared in numerous theatrical traditions all over the world. You might have been introduced to the general concept thanks to mimes, who, of course, act out everything wordlessly. You'll also see a lot of pantomime-style performance in old silent films. And as you have probably seen, this style of acting tends to be really broad and over the top, exaggerated so that you don't need words to understand what a character's feeling or thinking. Early video game character acting was, by necessity, loaded with pantomime. I mean, look at these poses. There is no subtlety to these emotes. It's almost like each character turns into a full-body emoji when they need to express a feeling. Just the most basic, classic, easy-to-interpret version of any emotion they feel. If I may, I would like to show you my favorite acting moment in the game, where Galuf finally recovers the memory that he'd lost, and he conveys this to us by physically picking up his amnesia and throwing it away. Now, if this were Final Fantasy XVI and that were Clive, that style of performance would be cartoonish and completely inappropriate, just the worst kind of overacting. But Bartz, Lena, Ferris, and Galuf, and Kryl do not have the luxury of subtlety. It is hard enough for them to express themselves at all. They are a clump of like 250 pixels and they're doing the best they can. And their best is actually pretty solid considering. With this new stockpile of poses, Final Fantasy V is able to pull off some pretty effective dramatic moments. Somber moments, moments of sacrifice, moments of comedy, moments of lap dance, I think? Moments of piano practice. Boy, I forget how weird Final Fantasy V is sometimes. Final Fantasy IV may have been the first game in this series to prioritize its characters, and the first to give those characters some means of animated expression. But Final Fantasy V is the first game in the series which truly begins to invest in that new direction. This is the first Final Fantasy game to treat character performance not just as important, but as a priority to be pursued and advanced. And the team was willing to do this, inflating their combat art workload by a factor of 22 per character, just so that Bartz, Lena, Ferris, and Galuf, and also Kryl, are always there with you, so that their current combat role never hides them from view. Every major animation investment this game makes is ultimately in service of character. And as fans of the franchise well know, the ambition on display here is really just getting warmed up. I hope you will join me next time as the Final Fantasy team brings the 16-bit era to a close in spectacular fashion. A huge thank you to my patrons, and thank you as well for watching. I'll see you next time.